Go.
Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And we are on our promises and fulfillment season. We are on episode 15. It's on covenant and medieval theology. And this chapter in the Covenant Theology book by Crossway and Reformed Theological Seminary is written by Douglas F. Kelly. Again, this is in the Covenant Theology book by Crossway and RTS. It's published by Crossway. And in our show notes, you can find a link to Crossway to get this book for yourself. You can find a link to the Society of Reformed Podcasters to find other like-minded Reformed podcasts out there. And you can find a couple links to find a Reformed church near you in the church finder to call home. So again, with this chapter, it's just Peter and myself, and it is within part 2 of this book, which is under historical theology. So if you didn't hear last week, please pause and go back because it was a phenomenal episode with Dr. Ligon Duncan, and he started off this new section in the book with covenant in the early church. So if you did listen to that episode, we're going to fast forward about 400 years or so where he left off. We're going to start medieval theology.
Yep. Yeah. And we'll record something pretty soon for this, but before we get to this, in case you guys haven't heard or saw on social media that we're officially planting a church under the oversights of Oceanside UMC with Danny Hyde. And so if you're in Orange County, or if you're thinking about moving to Orange County, or if you have friends or family in Orange County, please hit us up. Email us at santaanareformed@gmail.com if you want a church that will consistently preach the gospel to you. And we start our meetings in downtown Santa Ana in October, right around Reformation Day. So we're going to have some pretty cool posts coming up. So yeah, wanted to shout that out, and we'll create some stuff for that as it comes on. But I'm stoked to talk about the medieval church, medieval theology, because I think it's an area of history that a lot of Christians don't know what to do with.
Yeah, that's cool that you're talking about your church, and it's neat. Did you do that on purpose? Reformation Day, right around there, October 31st.
Yep.
Oh, very cool. And just so you guys, in case you guys aren't good at geography or know what he's even talking about with these locations, we are in Southern California, and we have probably the best weather out of anywhere in the country. So it's a little county called Orange County. It's in between, it's south of LA and it's north of San Diego. It's right on the ocean where there's a lot of good surfing.
That's right.
And the county seat, the kind of where the main airport of John Wayne is, in Santa Ana. It's kind of the main city. So if you ever heard of Anaheim, Disneyland, the Anaheim Angels and Anaheim Ducks. And so a lot of you heard of the city of Anaheim. That's just north of Santa Ana, and Santa Ana is just north of, San Diego County, pretty much. So it's right in the middle of Orange County.
Yeah. Yep. That's true.
So we'll jump right in to this episode. So like I said, where we left off with Dr. Duncan, I think he kind of left off around 2nd century, very early church fathers. Now we're jumping ahead to medieval times. So maybe help take us back in time. What's going on? Where are we? Why is it medieval times?
Yeah. Well, first off, everything's in black and white. Just kidding.
Everything's dirty.
Yeah, everything's dirty. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody brushes their teeth. Nobody showers.
That's what I think of medieval times. It's like everyone's living in dark castles, and
that's right. Yeah, which is probably not too far off the truth, to be super honest. But yeah, it's so, and a lot of scholars they try to figure out, because there's no nobody has a newspaper at the time and says today is the start of the medieval times. So that it doesn't shout out and say this is the exact date, but it's somewhere in the 6th century. So it's a couple centuries after the Roman Empire falls, and a lot of people will put it right around the birth or kind of the the ministry of Gregory the Great. So like in the 6th century-ish. So 500-ish AD, 520 to like 560 is about the time people think that the medieval time started. And it's kind of like it's kind of like a bad name. So people put medieval as a bad name on this time, like literally like it was dark. But that doesn't mean that the time was dark. It's just people don't know what to do with this time, so they call it dark. Medieval times. And so yeah, it's a couple hundred years after the early church, which doesn't mean that nothing happened between the 2nd century and the 6th century. There's actually some great theologians, namely Augustine was right smack in the middle of the 5th century. He died in 430 AD. And then there's a bunch of other theologians that are in this time, Ambrose. So yeah, it's not like there's nothing that's happening between this time and the medieval church. But it's a time where, there's a little bit less known. A lot of the texts get lost and people don't have access to the Bible. A lot of like no layperson has access to the Bible basically from the 6th century AD until about the 17th century AD. So there's 1100 years where people were still reading the Bible, as one of my professors, Dr. Clark, will still say, people still read the Bible, but in general, lay people did not have access to it. That's about the time that this starts, is the 6th century.
Well, if you're kind of a history buff or interested in learning more about that, that's kind of more of an extra conversation. And Dr. R. Scott Clark is phenomenal with explaining just historical things or what's going on. So always feel free to reach out to him. But this is pretty much post-Roman Empire fall, like you said, and it created kind of, I guess, a sort of a vacuum impact of what's going on in the rest of civilization across Europe. So I guess when they're talking about dark times, medieval times, it's kind of people were all in their different colonies across Europe trying to figure out, what to do from here now that the great empire has fallen. And so there was, probably sanitation issues, people trying to relearn how to live in society without the rule of a great Rome. There were certain things that were going on. I mean, you talked about physically dark time, like it could have actually been, there was actually a mini ice age during this time frame.
Yeah, later on,
Yeah, there was the Black Plague was going on, or the Black Death.
1340s,
Yeah, the Great Western Schism, 1378 to 1417.
Yeah, that's a fun story.
Yeah, I don't know much about it.
You know the Western Schism is a fun story, but that's for another time.
Yeah, and then the rise of nominalism, which is skeptical about reality and realism of the Christian morality in the church. So I think
there's nominalism and its opposite, voluntarism. And so there are two kind of understandings of how we understand how God works in this world. Like that's a broad brush, but generally speaking, those are the two categories used in this time.
Yeah, and so it's post-Roman Empire fall, but it's pre-Roman Catholic official church, because just as a reminder, based on historical facts, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't until the Council of Trent about 1542 to 1562 that takes place after what we're talking about in this chapter. So the Roman Catholic Church wasn't really a thing yet.
No, yeah, there was and that's the thing. I think a lot of people don't know what to do with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church says we go all the way back to St. Peter, obviously contemporary of Jesus, but
Roman Catholics will tell you that.
Yeah, Roman Catholics will tell you that. But then you ask them, show me the documentation. And they're like, our canon law. It's like, canon law is not documentation, because that changes all the time. Right. And so if you actually look, there's Catholic ideas from maybe the 9th century until the 15th century, but nothing's codified to say we are the Roman Catholic Church until the Council of Trent.
Yep. And just moving on a little bit, help me pronounce this, the Aristotelian metaphysics, which is kind of big. So Aristotle is a Greek philosopher pre-Christ.
something around 3rd century BC, if not a little bit before that, a little bit after Plato. So if you guys know Plato the philosopher, then Aristotle. So Aristotle wrote a couple philosophical books: physics, metaphysics, politics, and a lot of the language that he uses in these are used by a lot of the medieval theologians, which isn't bad. He's not an anti-Christian because he doesn't know the tradition, so he can't be anti something you don't know, generally speaking. And then so even our reformers, John Calvin uses a lot of Aristotelian metaphysics. So if you guys like, oh, that's a bad word, Aristotle. If you have been listening to our Covenant Theology series, when we say one substance, so one covenant of grace, multiple administrations, welcome to Aristotle's logic. That is precisely the same categories that he uses. We think they're good categories, so we take them and say, okay, that makes sense for what we see in the Bible. That's Aristotle.
That Aristotle guy had so much potential. He was really onto something. And,
he was close. If you read his works, he has some vague notion of an ultimate being. He doesn't quite get there, but he has some vague notion. But yeah, that's where a lot of medieval church theologians get their category. They don't get their theology from Aristotle. That's a wrong idea. They get their categories from Aristotle.
And the reason why we even bring up Aristotle in this episode, which is way after Aristotle's life, there are some, like you said, like that viewpoint still sticks on centuries later into this medieval time period. And these theologians and individuals that we're talking about in this chapter really get a lot of their views, whether they agree or not, with Aristotle. And so Aristotle has
the thing is, we still today get that, like when we call the sacraments, so people call sign things signified, that's also from Aristotle. When you talk about substance and accidents, which just doesn't mean like accidents like whoops, I did something dumb. Accidents just means things that can change. Substance is like the very thing that it is. So all of those things that we use are still Aristotle's logic.
Okay. So as we're talking about this chapter, we're talking about around AD 540, because that marks the birth time of Gregory the Great, who kind of kicked off just, I guess, unattachedly, like that was the beginning of the medieval period. And it wraps up the end of the 1400s. So to the 15th century is.
Yep.
And so that's the time frame. We're in Europe. Things are kind of chaotic. And so the people that we're talking about in this, Heinrich Bullinger, he is post-medieval, more the contemporary with Calvin, but he's mentioned in this chapter. He wasn't born until 1504. Peterlombard is talked a lot about in this chapter. He was born in 1100 and he died in 1160.
Yep.
He's actually the predecessor to Thomas Aquinas, who is born in 1225 to died in 1274. He's the successor to Peterlombard. He's probably the most mentioned in this chapter.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we got the pretty pre-medieval people in this chapter, which are Augustine and Aristotle. And then we have a couple other people. Averroes, he's a Muslim.
Averroes, yep.
Averroes, he's a Muslim. He's from 1126 to 1198. Florent Gabrielian, a Roman Catholic, is mentioned in here. And then Leo the Great. No, not my son Leo, even though he is Leo the Great. This Leo the Great was born AD 390 to 400, which is pre-medieval. And he has some significance with the church going forward into the medieval period. So now that I did that, what do you have to say more about this chapter?
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, most Christians and certainly a lot of Reformed Christians don't generally know what to do with the medieval church, because like Dr. Kelly talks about the very beginning of this chapter, we're not really sure what to do with this, because there's not much talk explicitly of a covenantal understanding of Scripture, and so it kind of looks like at first brush that, like what Dr. Duncan talked about last week, all this talk in the early church about the covenant, about the two different administrations and them being of the same people, of the ethne, of the nations and Abraham, and there being a pretty general consensus that we are of Abraham in the early church, and then following along the line with all these apostles, there's this confusion when you get to medieval church of what happens, like where does this explicit covenantal talk go? Do they still have an understanding of the covenantal structure of Scripture, because they don't say it outright? And I think Dr. Kelly does a good job kind of weaving through a lot of this stuff, and saying, they may not talk about it explicitly, but like looking at a tall like skyscraper, you see the outside, you see the edifice, you see the concrete on the outside, but you don't see, because it's not visible on the outside, you don't see the structure, you don't see the beams that support everything. And he says, in order for us to better understand the medieval church, we have to understand where they came from and what they led to. Especially so when you think of Martin Luther, one of the great reformers, even John Calvin, they were schooled. So John Calvin was more in a humanist school, which is kind of more Renaissance, which is post medieval times or medieval church or medieval theology. But Luther was very much schooled in a medieval school setting. So he was an Augustinian monk, which is still kind of medieval church kind of stuff. And so a lot of our reformers learned from a lot of these theologians. So they got a lot of their structure of the Bible from these theologians. I'm sure they said that some of the stuff wasn't good, but a lot of the stuff that they kept. And so you can't say outright the medieval church lost the Bible, because they got it from somewhere, and they still kind of helped this springboard for a lot of reformers to take the good from this stuff and say, hey, let's run with it. So I think Dr. Kelly did a really good job of describing this stuff where we didn't lose it. And the reformers took a lot of the good from the medieval church and brought it into kind of our contemporary times today. So that was kind of my initial observations from the chapter.
Okay. So talking about probably the two most main names in this chapter, Thomas Aquinas and Peterlombard.
Yeah.
How could you, to somebody that's brand new to this stuff, kind of just briefly introduce them to those two people and what kind of significances and backgrounds they have to the Christian church?
Yeah. So super short. So Peterlombard was a theologian in the 12th century, which is 1100s. And so he wrote a long treatise, the Sentences. And so these sentences were used really up until and through kind of the Reformation. And so if you wanted to be a theologian back in this day, back from, we'll say 12th to 15th century, basically your entrance exam was memorize the sentences, and you wrote a dissertation on the sentences. And you wrote a commentary on the sentences. And so you had to know his theology backwards and forwards. And so Dr. Kelly has a couple quotes from Lombard. And even though Peterlombard doesn't use quote unquote covenant language in this, so there's some stuff on page 313 and 314 that he talks about. Towards the bottom of 313 says, for instance, in Peterlombard's The Sentences, there's no separate distinction on the covenants. And so what he's talking about here is he doesn't see a distinction between the Old and New Testaments. He sees them as one flowing story of a single God. And this is especially true when you go to his doctrine of God. So his doctrine of God doesn't distinguish between Old and New Testaments. You're like, well, obviously it doesn't. Well, it's an entirely different theological landscape at this point, where there was talk of a different God in the Old Testament, New Testament. So when you put those two together, it's okay, this is kind of a different understanding. And so Lombard was kind of instrumental because he wrote kind of the big theological textbook that was used everywhere. And so Aquinas came on the scene in the 13th century. He had to go through Lombard sentences, wrote a commentary on Lombard sentences, dissertation, was teaching through Lombard sentences. And then he himself wrote what's called Summa Theologiae, which is the sum of theology. That's translated from Latin. And so that one's also a big work, and it has, I believe, 4 different parts to it. But he's also you can kind of consider him in a certain way a cage stage Calvinist. He had he had a certain understanding of salvation that was much closer to predestination than people give him credit for, even though he had a very high appreciation for kind of this growing Catholic doctrine of the church and tradition. But he also had an understanding of this unified covenants, even though he wouldn't say that specifically, between the Old and New Testaments. And so a lot of contemporary, or I guess Reformation contemporary theologians would interact a lot with Aquinas. So John Calvin and his institutes interacts a ton with Aquinas. Luther interacts a lot with Aquinas because he was in the same order, or Aquinas is in the Jesuit order, and Luther was in the Augustinian order. And so there's this like general flavor of covenantalism, because that was considered, how do we see these two testaments working together? And that was a lot of what they saw. They didn't see a distinction really between the Old Testament church and New Testament church. In general, they saw much more continuity between them than discontinuity. So that's kind of those two guys and their contribution in a very snapshot way.
So in a positive way, the reformers looked at Thomas Aquinas.
Calvin would quotes Calvin quotes Lombard, Calvin quotes Aquinas, both approvingly and disapprovingly, but more approvingly than I think people give him credit for. So there's a lot of thought in the medieval church that makes it through to the Reformation.
Mm-hmm. Something in the chapter too, that like the very first sentence kind of surprised me too. And he goes on to explain why, but he says in the very first sentence of his chapter, Dr. Kelly, he says, the Middle Ages saw the longest period of theological development of any time frame within the Western Christian tradition.
Yeah.
I was like, huh. Yeah. Like you said, like you wouldn't think that the Middle Ages was really a time of growth on anything.
Yeah, and he goes through it a little bit, and that a lot of it has to do with theological heresies or the growth of Muslim religion from like the 8th century up into Averroes, not up until, but like kind of through Averroes in the 12th century. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of it was like in reaction to a lot of bad stuff that the medieval theologians came up with these distinctions and really hammered on the doctrine of God. So I think Dr. Kelly goes through this. There's like different times in church history that certain doctrines have been really kind of nailed down. And during the medieval church, one of the doctrines that was really nailed down was the doctrine of God. So they had, I think they had really strong, so kind of early church, generally speaking, doctrine of Christ and Trinity were kind of the two big topics. And then medieval church, you got a lot of doctrine of God development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see that on page 315, page 314 and page 315, kind of what you're talking about. First with on the middle of page 314, you hear about medievals relied almost universally on Aristotle for logic and dialectic, which had been long worked into Christian teaching with Platonic tinge. With the spread of influence of such thinkers as Averroes, like you were talking about, who was a Muslim, followed in the naturalistic line of the original Aristotle, renewed theories of eternal creation, the morality of the soul, the one universal intellect for people began to affect the Christian intellectual elite. And so, to say the least, this growing movement constituted a serious intellectual problem for Orthodox Christian theology.
What's that?
Sorry. You're recording.
What's up?
I just got home, so I didn't hear you.
I thought you were going to the gym.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I can edit this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't respond to this.
Oh, sorry.
You didn't hear me?
No. Well, hi was first.
Can we get him?
That's fine. I'll take him.
Should open the window. It's hot in
Yeah, it is. That's why I have the fan.
Sorry. Hi, Nick.
Hello.
Okay, I'll pause it. Go.
So yeah, that was just wrapping up on what you're saying about the various.
Yeah, so it's like you're saying, so we always kind of have to understand the context a lot of these times. We can't just look at these times and kind of separate them from the context and say like, well, why didn't they talk about covenants? Why didn't they specifically say the word covenant? And a lot of it has to do with what's the context, the time, the heresies that are around, the other religious groups that are in the area that they're responding to. That's really big in this time period.
Yeah. And going back to what you're saying, how the Aristotelian thought was really prevalent. Actually, Aquinas responded to what I was reading before at the bottom of page 314 by appropriating significant elements of the Aristotelian thought, distinctions between general and specific, substance and accidents, form and matter, potentially and actually, and the account of human knowledge, sense of perception. And he fit those ideas into Orthodox Christian theology while also rejecting carefully articulated reasons of Aristotle's secular assumptions.
And this has to do with something we were talking about pre-recording. Is there's some understanding before this, and it's a little bit tied to Aristotle and some other thinkers of this day, but that God was codependent and was not free from creation. And so he was creating something that Aquinas is very well known for, is his distinction between the creator and the creation. And so generally speaking, I think we get that from the reformers when they get it from Aquinas. Really, very specifically, is where that doctrine, that understanding comes from, that's where kind of the nominalist position, the voluntarist position, a lot of these wrestle with how does God relate to the world. Voluntarist is God can make any decision. He's a free, and it sounds better than you think it is, or it sounds better than it actually is. Where God is voluntary, he's not restricted by anything. So effectively, like as Reformed Christians, we say God's not restricted, but he is perfectly himself in whatever he does. And so, quote unquote, he has restrictions, like he can't lie. That's technically a restriction on God, even though like it sounds weird to say that stuff. But God is who he is whenever he acts. He's never not himself. Versus a lot of these other positions will say, in a sense, he reacts to creation, or he's not defined by anything else, and he can just do whatever he wants. And so Aquinas comes in and says, no, that's not what Scripture says. Scripture says God is distinct, and he acts upon creation.
Yeah, I mean, God wouldn't be God if he started lying and doing anything less than being perfectly who he is. And actually, to what you're saying exactly, on page it starts on page 322 under the title "The Medieval Doctrine of God." We start talking about Dr. Kelly in this chapter starts talking about in Exodus 3:13 when God answers Moses when Moses asking, well, who do I say that you are? And he says, I am who I am. And then so Dr. Kelly starts expanding on that throughout the rest of most of this chapter, actually to the end of the chapter, about the deep doctrine of God being in essence of who he just is. He just is who he is. There's nothing before God. He is the pure essence that made everything else. So it goes back to the creation distinction as well.
Yeah, and maybe a lot of you guys listen to this right now. I was like, well, duh, that's what God says in Exodus. So he is who he is, and he doesn't change. Where that was very distinctive in this time, where there was some, there was some other understandings of who God is, where he's not bound by anything. He's part of creation, very literally, even though he created creation, he's part of it himself. Whereas Reformed Christians like, no, he's not part of creation. He is outside of creation, yet he still interacts with creation through his son, Jesus.
It feels like in this chapter, during this time in medieval Europe, that there's a hunger for a need of being reminded and know who God is. And it's interesting that we go back to, obviously, the important thing to know in this chapter is that the Old Testament and the New Testament are connected.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But even going back, and we're not talking deeply into the Gospels and stuff, which are still just as good, but this chapter is going into like explaining the essence of who God is. Like we're having to remind the people, I am who I am. Like, so I think people in the medieval time are like, they kind of want to relearn the Bible, maybe, and the covenants.
Yeah, and that has to do with a lot of the theological flavor environment of the day, where the doctrine of God wasn't lost; it was just blurred. And it's the same thing where we have Arius in the 4th century, who's talking about there was a time when the Son was not. So he's talking about that the Son, Jesus Christ, was not eternally generated from eternity past, that he has no creation date and no end. And Arius in the 4th century denied that the Son was eternally generated, that he was a created being. And so you see a lot of theological talk in the 4th century about Christ's dual nature, his fully man and fully God. And so you're like, when you read these times, you're like, why didn't they talk about other doctrines? It's because they're responding to very specific heresies at that time that they need to make sure are codified for the church from there on out. Same thing as the medieval church, where one of the things that's kind of lost is a biblical doctrine of God.
There we go. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah,
it's probably confused everybody.
That's why we have each other. But that's what the medieval church, I think, in a very real sense, recovers nearly fully, and then kind of hands off to the Reformation and says, "Here you go."
I like that. Yeah, we get back to explaining the doctrine of God, and I mean, I think that's what really pointed out to me, because we start going into the very beginning of the Bible, close to the beginning of the Bible, going through Exodus, just explaining I am who I am and the deep doctrine of who God is. And
I'm sure a lot of people listening right now are like, why aren't they talking about covenant more often? And we kind of signaled this at the very beginning, and it's because just the word covenant isn't used all that often in this time period, and it's not really developed all that much. But what Dr. Kelly talks about at various points, and at the very end on page 326 or 325, he says it directly. It's because it gives it structure. And so a lot of what the theologians are talking about from the Old Testament, New Testament, assumes that the Old Testament, New Testament are cohesive in some certain sense, that there's continuity between the Old and New Testament. So the very last paragraph, the first and last sentences, Dr. Kelly says, to have relied so directly on Moses demonstrates that Aquinas knew well of the lasting covenant established by God, which undergirded both Old and New Testaments. And in the very end, says, but it was nonetheless powerful for all that, giving solid substance to what we now call medieval theologies. There had to be an underlying assumption that what the Old Testament says is not different than what the New Testament says, and it provides the same doctrine of God we get from Old to New Testament. So there's some structural stuff they see of the Bible and the continuity that allows a lot of the medieval theologians to say what they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're bridging the gap to, I mean, we say that in our show, but that's kind of what they're doing. I mean, they're finding context and thought of the day and the major players of that people look to for understanding, and they introduce doctrine to the time of the day, to what they're looking for, what questions they're asking.
Exactly. Yeah.
What questions they're asking.
There's certain questions that are asked in the early church. There's certain questions that are asked in the medieval church, and there's certain questions that are asked in the Reformation church. Doesn't mean that we have different doctrinal understandings. It means we're responding to different questions. But then in order for us to respond to those questions, the undergirding structure of covenant still has to be there for us to answer those questions, as we would in the early church, as we would in the medieval church, and as we would in the Reformation church too.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of this medieval time, something that's good that Dr. Kelly mentions, at the middle of page 325, he says, and this kind of wraps up to what we've been talking about so far. He says, there is but one God, and this God is being, because going back to the I am statement, and this is the cornerstone of all Christian philosophy. So we go to Christ, kind of talking about Christ there. And it was not Plato. This was definitely Plato's definitely pre-medieval. It was not Aristotle. Again, that was a pre-medieval person that a lot of people in medieval times were looking towards for understanding. It was Moses put in that position. Put in position. So they're going back to like, let me remind you of those Plato and Aristotle guys. Those are great, human thinkers, but let me show you a really good guy in human history who understood and talked about God. It was Moses. And let's go to scripture and explain what God said to Moses when he asked the big question to God, who do I say that you are? And that answers the time of the day in medieval time, the doctrine of God. I am.
Yeah, and I think that's something so crucial to get about the medieval church is it's not that the medieval church, like we said at the beginning of this episode, lost the Bible and the Reformation church refound the Bible. It's the Reformation took the thought from the early church and the medieval church, took what they got, basically were handed the baton and says, okay, now your turn to develop more of these doctrines, develop more of a covenantal understanding. The Reformation church, as you guys will hear next week with Dr. Clark, that's a little plug for who's coming on next week for you guys. But they took this baton and then they started developing a liturgy, a worship, stuff that was in distinction from the Catholic understanding of how these elements worked. But it's to say all of this, that the medieval church didn't lose the Bible. They weren't like wandering around for 1100 years, not sure what to do with themselves. They still had theological emphases. They still had great theologians that we are still learning from today. And they had an understanding. So the very fact that Aquinas goes back to Moses, builds his doctrine of God from Moses, assumes that Aquinas saw a structure in the Bible that allowed him to take a doctrinal understanding of God in the Old Testament and pull that through to the New Testament, say it's the same exact God doing the same exact things, which for us is covenantal.
There we go. Thank goodness for Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah.
I mean, he was he's the main guy of this chapter, hugely significant during this period of human history. So I feel like with AD 2021, the world probably looks and seems way different than medieval times, but I feel like there's some similarities. A lot of culture needs to be reminded the doctrine of God.
Yeah. I mean, R.C. Sproul built his ministry off the holiness of God. And so he talked about an understanding of we need to build back a doctrine of God, which, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with at all. And I mean, I think some of the current kind of heresies or misunderstandings generally now around the Trinity, which involves the doctrine of God. But we always have to go back to what Aquinas did. And I think a lot of Christians have a bad taste in their mouth if they either come from the Catholic context or know about the Catholic context, as Aquinas is so tied to the Catholic context. They're like, well, we can't read him as a Catholic. But he's got so much good stuff. I mean, I probably read 75% of his stuff during school, going through his Summa Theologiae. There's so much good stuff in what he says. And so you can't throw away everything. You can't throw the baby with the bathwater when there's so much good stuff. When you realize, like, when you read Aquinas, it's a little bit like reading Calvin. He is that much breadth of his understanding of Scripture. And if you read Calvin, you realize how much he relies on a lot of these medieval and early church theologians, because guess who the Reformation read? They read medieval theologians. That's just what they did. They read medieval theologians, they read early church theologians. And so in order for us to have an understanding of medieval church, we should look at the reformers and say, how did you guys read it? How did you guys understand it? And they saw a lot of the same thought that they themselves published.
Wow. I imagine this is going to be a lot of new historical information people haven't really been exposed to.
Probably not. No. Well, they're probably like, I mean, just like I was, you're probably
Yeah.
a little bit like timid going to the medieval times. You're like, oh, this is the dark times. This is when nothing good happened. 1100 years of a vacuum. The Roman Empire fell. Like what? Nothing basically happened for 1100 years. And so like, you're like, what's there to learn from the medieval times when there's a lot to learn? There's some great doctrines that were developed and handed off to the Reformation Church that we still benefit from today.
So it's done more than inspire some fantastic movies and scenes for entertainment.
Monty Python, all that stuff. Oh yeah.
I mean, it's rich with history.
Yeah.
And there was like surprisingly a big growth in theology during that time. I mean, it was a gigantic period of time. It went again from the 6th century to almost the 15th century. That's a long period of time.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe to re-emphasize it for people who were checked out, because I checked out during podcasts too.
You checked out while I was rambling for a while.
I was checking out while Nick was talking.
Yep.
But it's, I think so often we think when, again, we're talking about the reformers a lot, but it's because reformers, I mean, when they first started the Reformation, they weren't reading reformers. It wasn't like John Calvin's institutes weren't available to Martin Luther in 1519 or 1517 when he posted the 75 or 95 Theses, or in 1519 when he was lecturing through Galatians or Psalms. He wasn't reading reformers back then. He was still reading medieval theologians. He was still reading Aquinas. He was still reading Duns Scotus, all these guys who were part of this church. And a lot of his theology came from these guys. And so we can read a lot of these guys, and while they may not explicitly state it, they're still going to assume a lot of the same structure of the Bible that we assume. So for you to get your doctrine of God from the Old Testament, there has to be an assumption that the God of the Old Testament works the same way as the God of the New Testament. And for you to have that understanding, you have to have some covenantal context to see God working the same way in both Testaments, because that's what we say as covenantal theologians. God worked the same way in the Old Testament as he does in the New. Although he expands the Old Testament to the New, it's still the same substance as the Old. And that's the medieval theologians saw a lot of the same stuff.
So the medieval theologians were in a time and place, obviously, post-resurrection of Christ.
Yep.
So they knew the name of the Savior, Jesus Christ, just like we do.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, just like we do, they need to be reminded about the doctrine of God.
Yeah. And that's something I think they developed better than the early church, and they gave a pretty robust doctrine of God to the Reformation, that the Reformation, I mean, really, again, if you read Calvin, you read Luther, read Bullinger, read all these reformers, they get their doctrine of God from the medieval church.
So with the medieval theologians learning, being reminded and about the doctrine of God through mainly Thomas Aquinas, how did that help their justification and edification and sanctification towards who Christ is and what his finished work already did?
I'm going to leave a little cliffhanger on that one and say Dr. Clark will answer for that for us next week.
That's exactly why I asked the question. I just felt it.
We're going the same wavelength. Yep, Dr. Clark will pretty much start with that, and he's gonna lead you guys into a tour de force of the Reformation.
Oh yeah, you're gonna, like, in your head, you're gonna see to be continued ... So that's where we're gonna bridge from here.
Cliffhanger.
So to give you some taste of what's coming for the next episode, how many years are we gonna jump from where this chapter ends? I would say this chapter ends close to the end of the 15th century. The next chapter is Covenant and Reformation Theology,
which starts with Luther, which is Luther's kind of a transitionary figure from a medieval theologian to a Reformation theologian. So, like, I mean, you get something from like 1480 to 1520. There's a transition period where there's some inklings of the Reformation before then, but it hits hard about 1520.
Yep. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff between this chapter and the next that the Roman Catholic Church does that kicks off a very angry Martin Luther.
Yep. Yeah. Very angry Martin Luther. And I mean, what you can say a whole lot, but maybe I'll leave with this because it's a misunderstanding, and I've already kind of alluded to it. But the Roman Catholic Church didn't start in the medieval times.
Nope. They
started after the Reformation. They were a response to the Reformation.
Isn't that interesting? You know, when I was part of the Roman Catholic Church, like any Roman Catholic, we were like, oh, we're the original Christians. That's the first Christian church. And that's historically just not accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not accurate. Also, it's Roman church was not the Roman church. There were Catholic inklings throughout, but I mean, if you asked Luther or Calvin, they would have effectively said we're Catholic theologians, but Catholic in the universal reform sense, not in the. But yeah, we'll get into this stuff with Dr. Clark. But I mean, hopefully you guys saw that Covenant Theology, while it may not have been named and wasn't as developed in the medieval church, was assumed in a lot of things that they understood within theological topics of the day. So hopefully you guys saw that, even though it's a hard time to go through because there's not much explicit mention. It's that structure that theology is built upon.
Mm-hmm. They're building blocks and structures. They're architectonic structures of beams and pillars for the Bible. That's what Michael Horton says.
Yep.
And for next episode, we're not going to have too hard of a time holding Dr. Clark back talking about the response to the Roman Catholic Church. This is what he does.
He's a raging bull, and all we're going to do is just kind of open up the door and just let him rip.
I'm going to crack a beer and probably put my Zoom meeting on mute and just let him go.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you guys learned a little bit about some theologians and learned some stuff about medieval theology, and maybe you'll pick up some of these guys and let Douglas Kelly, let Dr. Kelly kind of hold your hand throughout this time. And if you guys pick up some of these works, I would suggest it. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode, and look forward to next week with Dr. Clark on Reformation history.
Thanks, guys.